HOA workers hammered a ribbon-cutting stage into the grass beside my private lake at 6:40 a.m. Diane Caldwell stood near the shoreline, directing crews to hang a banner that read grand opening for the county guests arriving that afternoon. My dock, my spillway road, and my water control gate sat directly behind their temporary fence. If that gate was adjusted without the right permits, every downstream drainage easement tied to 3 neighborhoods could be affected. A news van rolled onto the gravel road. Then 2 more trucks followed. The smell of diesel mixed with wet grass and fresh plywood. They were not trespassing quietly anymore. They were advertising it. That was Diane's first mistake. Her second was building the celebration directly above the valve box. I stood near the tree line with my coffee still warm in my hand and watched a worker zip-tie balloons to the warning rail I had installed myself. Red, white, and blue ribbons snapped in the morning wind. Folding chairs faced the water like a church service. Portable speakers crackled as someone tested a microphone. The lake looked calm behind them, dark and glassy under the gray dawn. That calm was misleading. Lakes like mine do not sit there by accident. They breathe through culverts, gates, spillways, and drainage agreements most people never notice until something stops working. Diane noticed none of it. She stood in white pants and a pale green blazer, smiling at a clipboard like she had just conquered a resort. "Move that old sign," she told a worker. He pointed at the metal plate bolted near the valve box. "Private water control access. No unauthorized operation." Diane waved her hand like the sign was a weed. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. The cardboard bent slightly under my thumb. "My name is Ethan Walker. I am 47 years old, and I am a civil engineer." That lake was not a neighborhood pond. It was a private retention lake built on my family's land, tied to water rights, drainage permits, and a control structure my father maintained for 30 years before I took over. Diane knew the pretty part. The view, the dock, the cattails moving in the wind. She did not know the system. Under it. By 8 o'clock, county guests had started arriving early. A sheriff's cruiser parked near the entrance. 2 county commissioners stepped out of a black SUV. Families walked down the hill carrying coolers and folding blankets. Someone placed a donation box beside the stage. That detail caught my eye. A donation box meant they were not just celebrating. They were collecting money on property they did not own. I took pictures. The stage, the banner, the fence, the donation box, the workers near the valve rail. Every timestamp mattered now. Then Diane spotted me across the grass. Her smile widened. She walked over with 2 board members behind her and a local reporter trailing close enough to hear everything. "Ethan," she said, sweet as iced tea left too long in the sun. "I hope you are not here to make a scene." I looked past her at the lake. The morning light had shifted. The surface near the spillway showed a faint pull, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Water whispered softly against the concrete lip. Diane kept talking about community access, outdated property boundaries, and public benefit. I let her finish. Then I looked down at the valve box under her banner. A fresh padlock hung from the latch, and it was not mine. Then the water line moved. The faint pull near the spillway became stronger with every passing second. Most people could not see it. They were watching the stage, the banners, and the arriving guests. I was watching the water. Tiny ripples curved toward the concrete outlet instead of drifting with the wind. That should not have been happening. Not at that rate. I walked past Diane without answering her last comment and headed toward the valve enclosure. The smell of wet earth grew stronger as I moved downhill. Behind me, a microphone squealed across the speakers. Someone laughed. Someone else tested music for the ceremony. The celebration continued. The lake kept moving. I stopped beside the box and looked at the unfamiliar padlock. Fresh metal. No rust. Installed recently. A worker carrying extension cords noticed me examining it. He slowed down. "They told us not to touch that area," he said. "Who told you?" I asked. He glanced toward the stage. That answer was enough. Another county vehicle rolled into the parking area above the shoreline. More guests stepped out. Cameras appeared. Diane loved attention. Today she was getting plenty of it. I crouched beside the enclosure and checked the inspection seal. Broken. My jaw tightened. The seal had been intact 3 days earlier. A cold breeze crossed the lake. Reeds along the shoreline rustled softly. Something beneath the surface was changing faster than it should. I stood and pulled out my phone. First, I photographed the broken seal. Then the lock. Then the warning signs. Every image carried a timestamp. Evidence ages quickly when crowds get involved. A burst of applause erupted near the stage. Diane had climbed onto the platform. Her voice echoed through the speakers. This beautiful community resource belongs to everyone. More applause followed. I looked at the water again. The surface near the spillway had dropped another fraction of an inch. Small, nearly invisible, but measurable. That mattered. I walked toward the dock and knelt beside one of the support posts. Years ago, I had marked reference measurements into the wood after a storm season. Most people would never notice them. I checked the nearest mark, then checked it again. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. The numbers confirmed what my eyes were seeing. The lake was losing water. Fast. Not naturally. Not from evaporation. Not from summer heat. Something upstream or inside the control system had changed. A county commissioner approached the shoreline with a camera crew. He pointed toward the water while a reporter recorded footage. Diane joined them moments later. She smiled for photographs. She spoke confidently about recreation, tourism, and future improvements. Nobody asked who controlled the lake. Nobody asked how the system worked. Yet, the smell of grilled food drifted from a catering tent near the road. Volunteers unloaded coolers and folding tables. Children ran across the grass, carrying small flags. The entire event felt bigger than a neighborhood gathering now. Diane had invited half the county, which meant half the county was about to become witness to whatever happened next. A sudden metallic clank echoed from inside the enclosure behind the stage. Not loud, just enough to make me turn. Then it happened again. One of the workers looked over his shoulder. So did another. The sound stopped. The music resumed. The speeches continued. But the waterline kept falling. I opened my truck and removed a weathered binder from behind the passenger seat. Engineering records. Inspection logs. Flow measurements. Maintenance reports. If someone had tampered with the system, the answers would be inside those pages. As I flipped to the most recent inspection report, one handwritten note immediately caught my eye. Someone had accessed the gate 2 nights earlier. The handwritten note sat at the bottom of the inspection report in faded blue ink. Access gate opened for unauthorized review. No permit on file. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. The sounds of the celebration drifted across the grass behind me. Music. Laughter. Folding chairs scraping against the ground. The entire county seemed focused on the stage. Nobody was paying attention to the system keeping the lake alive. I closed the binder and walked toward the maintenance shed near the spillway road. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. A pair of volunteers passed carrying boxes of bottled water. One smiled and asked if I was attending the ceremony. I nodded and kept moving. The smell of fresh barbecue smoke floated through the air. The event looked more like a county fair with every passing minute. That was exactly what worried me. The larger the crowd became, the larger the fallout would be. I unlocked the maintenance shed and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. The room smelled of metal, oil, and damp concrete. Sunlight pushed through a dusty window near the back wall. I opened a cabinet containing inspection logs dating back years. Every entry was organized by date, weather conditions, and flow measurements. I found the report from 2 nights earlier. The same date mentioned in the note. My eyes moved across the page. Rainfall, water elevation, gate position, inspection complete. Then a second line appeared beneath it. Follow-up inspection recommended. Unusual adjustment detected. My stomach tightened. Somebody had moved the gate. Not enough to trigger an emergency. Just enough to increase outflow. Slow. Controlled. Easy to miss. I heard applause outside. A louder wave this time. Diane must have started another speech. I grabbed the report and headed back toward the lake. The shoreline looked different already. The change was subtle, but I knew every foot of that waterline. Rocks hidden yesterday now sat exposed along the edge. Wet mud glistened in the sunlight. A fisherman standing near the dock frowned at the shoreline and shifted his boat trailer a little farther down the ramp. He noticed it too. That mattered. Once ordinary people start noticing changes, questions follow. A local reporter walked past me toward the stage. She carried a camera and a notebook. Behind her came a county engineer I recognized from previous permit reviews. That caught my attention immediately. Engineers see things politicians miss. I watched him stop near the shoreline. He looked at the water, then at the spillway, then back at the water. He did not stay long, but his expression changed slightly before he walked away. Another detail. Another crack in the story Diane was selling. I reached the dock and checked the measurement marks again. The water had dropped another inch. Faster now. The wind pushed small waves against the posts, creating a hollow knocking sound beneath the boards. I opened my phone and recorded a video showing the marks. Evidence first. Questions later. A burst of cheers erupted from the stage. Diane raised both arms as photographers snapped pictures. Behind her, the giant banner fluttered above the valve enclosure. She looked proud, victorious, completely unaware of what was happening below her feet. Then a pickup truck rolled into the parking area carrying 2 men from the Regional Water Management Office. I recognized the logo on the door immediately. They were not on the guest list. The 2 men stepped out of the truck and immediately looked past the stage toward the water. Neither of them glanced at the banner. Neither seemed interested in the speeches. They carried clipboards instead of cameras. That told me everything I needed to know. One of them adjusted his sunglasses and pointed toward the spillway. The other nodded. Then they started walking. A warm breeze pushed across the lake. The banner snapped overhead. Diane was still speaking into the microphone. Her voice echoed through the speakers while guests drifted between food tents and folding chairs. The event looked successful from a distance. Up close, the cracks were getting harder to hide. I moved along the shoreline and intercepted the 2 water management officials before they reached the stage. Both recognized me. We had reviewed permits together years earlier. "Ethan," one of them said, "you seeing what we are seeing?" I looked toward the water. "Depends what you were seeing." He glanced back at the lake. The level should not be dropping this fast. That was the first time someone else had said it out loud. The second official crouched near the shoreline and studied a patch of exposed mud. A dark wet line marked where the water had been only hours earlier. He photographed it. Then another section. Then another. Nearby, a family stopped taking pictures and started looking at the shoreline too. Questions were spreading. Slowly. Naturally. The dangerous kind. The kind nobody could control once they started. A burst of applause rolled across the lawn. Diane had finished another speech. Music resumed. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air. Volunteers handed out drinks. Children tossed a beach ball near the water. One throw landed farther than expected because the shoreline had already pulled back several feet. The child looked confused. So did his parents. The first official opened his clipboard. "Any maintenance activity recently?" he asked. "Not authorized maintenance," I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. I handed him copies of the inspection notes from my binder. He read the handwritten entry twice. The second official joined him. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any argument. A camera crew passed nearby. One reporter noticed the officials studying documents and slowed down. Then she kept walking. For now, I knew. That would not last. News crews are drawn to tension the way gulls are drawn to boats. Another gust of wind rippled across the lake. The surface looked different now. Larger sections of submerged rock had become visible. Several boats tied near the dock were sitting lower against their mooring lines. I checked the measurement post again. Another inch gone. Maybe more. My stomach settled into a calm I recognized from engineering emergencies. Panic helps nobody. Data helps everybody. I pulled out my phone and compared current photos with images taken earlier that morning. The difference was obvious. Even on a small screen. The officials studied them carefully. "This timeline is getting difficult to explain," one of them said quietly. Before I could answer, a sharp metallic pop echoed from the direction of the enclosure beneath the stage. Heads turned. Music continued, but several guests looked around. The sound came again. Shorter this time. Then silence. Diane glanced toward the noise, but kept smiling for photographs. She did not seem concerned. That surprised me. It should not have. She was still looking at the event. I was looking at the system underneath it. The second official lowered his clipboard and stared directly at the stage platform. His expression changed. "Who authorized construction over that access point?" he asked. Nobody around us seemed eager to answer. Then a county commissioner began walking toward our group with a reporter right behind him. The county commissioner slowed as he approached our group. The reporter beside him immediately noticed the inspection reports in the official's hands. Her camera operator lifted his rig without being told. That was how these moments always started. Quietly. One person notices something. Then everyone notices. The commissioner looked from the exposed shoreline to the documents. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. The breeze carried music across the lawn. Children were still playing near the food tents. Guests continued taking pictures beside the lake. From a distance, the event looked perfectly normal. Up close, it was beginning to unravel. One of the water management officials finally spoke. "We are trying to understand why the water level is dropping." The commissioner frowned. "How much?" The official pointed toward the dock. We all turned. Even from 30 yards away, the change was visible now. The dark wet line along the support post sat noticeably higher than the current water line. The commissioner adjusted his glasses. The reporter took notes. The camera remained rolling. Another small piece of the story had just become public. Diane noticed the gathering and started walking toward us. Her smile stayed in place, but her pace quickened. She reached the group carrying the same confidence she had displayed all morning. "Everything all right?" she asked. The commissioner glanced at the officials. Neither answered. Diane's smile weakened slightly. Only slightly. She still believed she controlled the situation. "We are discussing a water level concern," one official finally said. Diane laughed softly. "It is a lake. Water levels change." A few people nearby nodded. That explanation sounded reasonable. For about 3 seconds. Then the second official pointed toward the shoreline. "Not like this." Silence followed. The reporter wrote that sentence down immediately. Diane looked toward the water for the first time in several minutes. I watched her expression carefully. She finally saw it. The exposed rocks. The widening strip of mud. The dock posts showing fresh marks. The visual evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. A gust of wind rolled across the lake. Small waves slapped against the shoreline. The sound seemed louder now, more noticeable. A volunteer carrying drinks stopped walking and stared at the water. Then another guest did the same. Then another. The crowd's attention was shifting away from the stage. Diane felt it happening. "The event is proceeding as planned," she said firmly. Nobody responded. The commissioner looked at me. "You own this property, correct?" "Yes." "And the water control infrastructure?" "Yes." The reporter's head snapped up from her notebook. Another important detail had entered the conversation. Diane immediately stepped in. "The HOA has community access agreements." "Access is not ownership," I said. My voice stayed calm. The officials exchanged a quick glance. They knew the difference. So did the commissioner. The reporter underlined something in her notes. Across the lawn, another burst of metallic noise echoed from beneath the stage. This time more people heard it. Conversations paused. Several guests turned toward the sound. Even the music seemed quieter afterward. The first official asked a simple question. "Has anyone accessed the gate controls recently?" Diane hesitated. It lasted less than a second. But everyone saw it. "I would have to check," she replied. The answer landed poorly. The commissioner folded his arms. The reporter stopped writing and simply watched. A bead of sweat slid down Diane's temple despite the mild temperature. The celebration she had carefully planned was no longer the main attraction. The lake was. Then one of the county engineers who had arrived earlier came jogging up the shoreline carrying a tablet. His face told me he had found something important. The county engineer moved through the crowd quickly, holding a tablet against his chest. His breathing was steady, but his expression had changed. That got everyone's attention before he even spoke. The commissioner stepped forward first. The reporter followed immediately behind him. Diane remained frozen beside the stage, still trying to maintain the appearance of control. The engineer stopped near the shoreline and turned the tablet toward the officials. "I pulled archived infrastructure records," he said. Nobody interrupted him. Even the nearby conversations seemed to fade. The only sounds were wind across the water and distant music from the speakers. He tapped the screen. "The lake elevation has dropped nearly 4 inches since this morning." Several guests overheard him. Heads turned. 4 inches sounded different from a vague concern. 4 inches sounded measurable. Real. The reporter wrote furiously. The commissioner looked at the water again. This time he did not need anyone to explain what he was seeing. The evidence sat directly in front of him. The engineer swiped to another page. "There is more." That sentence landed heavily. Diane shifted her weight. One of the water management officials folded his arms. The engineer enlarged a diagram on the screen. I recognized it instantly. It was an older infrastructure map showing the spillway system, drainage channels, and control gate configuration. Most people would see a confusing collection of lines and symbols. I saw a complete story. The engineer pointed at a highlighted section. The outflow rate increased sometime within the last 48 hours. The commissioner frowned. Naturally, No, the answer came fast. Too fast to misunderstand. A murmur spread through the crowd. The smell of grilled food still floated through the air, but nobody seemed interested in eating anymore. Attention had shifted completely. Several guests left the food tent and moved closer to the shoreline. The event was no longer a celebration. It was becoming an investigation. Diane stepped forward. There must be some mistake. Her voice remained calm, but not as calm as before. The engineer looked directly at her. The data does not show a mistake. Silence followed. The lake itself seemed quieter. Even the small waves lapping against the shoreline sounded sharper somehow. I watched the commissioner study the map. Then he looked toward the stage. Then toward the valve enclosure beneath it. The connection was finally forming in his mind. So was everyone else's. The first water management official crouched near the exposed shoreline again and drove a measuring rod into the mud. He recorded the depth. Then another measurement. Then another. Every number supported the same conclusion. The lake was draining faster than it should. Nearby, a family who had arrived for the ceremony packed up their folding chairs without saying much. They were not leaving because of weather. They were leaving because something felt wrong. People always sense that before they understand it. The reporter approached the engineer. "Who controls this system?" she asked. Several people leaned closer. The engineer pointed toward me. The infrastructure records list Ethan Walker as the responsible owner and maintenance authority. The reporter immediately looked my way. So did half the crowd. Diane looked too. For the first time all day, she seemed to realize this was not simply a property dispute. The system she had built her event around belonged to someone else. A loud creak echoed from the dock. Several guests turned toward the sound. One of the floating platforms had settled lower against its supports as the water receded. The visual change was impossible to ignore now. The commissioner removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. "I think we need access to that enclosure," he said quietly. Then everyone looked at the lock. Every eye followed the commissioner's gaze toward the enclosure beneath the stage. The bright banner hanging above it suddenly looked ridiculous. A few hours earlier, it had been the centerpiece of the celebration. Now it looked like a curtain hiding a problem. The unfamiliar padlock reflected sunlight as the crowd slowly gathered closer. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. That made the moment feel heavier. The music finally stopped. For the first time all afternoon, the lakefront became quiet. Wind moved through the tall grass. Water tapped softly against the exposed rocks along the shoreline. Somewhere behind the food tent, a folding chair collapsed with a sharp snap. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to speak first. The commissioner broke the silence. "Who installed that lock?" Diane looked toward several HOA board members. None answered. One man adjusted his sunglasses and looked away. Another studied the ground. The response told its own story. The reporter noticed it too. Her camera operator zoomed in. Diane crossed her arms. "I am sure there is a reasonable explanation." The first water management official walked to the enclosure and examined the lock. He checked the broken inspection seal beside it. Then he photographed both. Click, click, click. Each shutter sound felt louder than normal. Evidence accumulates quietly. The crowd shifted closer. More county guests left the stage area. Even people who had no idea how drainage systems worked could sense something important was happening. I opened my binder again and removed several maintenance records. The engineer joined me. Together we compared inspection dates against access logs. The smell of warm concrete rose from the spillway road as afternoon sunlight intensified. Sweat rolled down the side of one board member's face. He kept checking his phone. Another mini detail. Another crack. The commissioner accepted the records and read them carefully. These logs show authorized access only through the owner or designated inspectors. "Correct," I said. He looked at the lock again. "And this lock is not yours." "No," the reporter wrote down every word. Diane's expression hardened. Not angry. Defensive. She was beginning to understand that public relations could not solve an engineering problem. A child near the shoreline pointed toward the dock. "Look." Several adults turned. The floating platform had settled even lower. One corner now sat noticeably closer to the surface. Conversations spread through the crowd. Quiet at first, then louder. People compare observations when uncertainty grows. The lake was creating its own witnesses. The second water management official returned from the shoreline carrying fresh measurements. He handed them to the engineer. The engineer reviewed the numbers. Then he looked up. The loss rate increased again. Another sentence nobody wanted to hear. Diane stepped forward immediately. Can this be corrected? The engineer paused before answering. First, we need to understand what changed. That answer hung in the air. Nearby, the reporter requested a brief statement from the commissioner. He declined. Smart move. Nobody wanted to commit to conclusions yet. The facts were still forming. A county deputy approached the group and quietly spoke with the commissioner. I could not hear every word, but one phrase carried clearly through the breeze. Construction permit request. The commissioner's eyebrows lifted. He turned toward Diane. Was a permit submitted for the stage placement? Diane hesitated again. The same hesitation as before. Short, visible, dangerous. Behind her, one of the board members suddenly looked alarmed. Not nervous, alarmed. He stepped away from the group and began moving quickly toward a stack of event boxes behind the stage. That movement caught my attention immediately. It also caught the reporter's attention. She pointed her camera toward him. Then the board member pulled a folder from one of the boxes and tried to leave. The board member froze the moment he realized the camera was pointed at him. For a second, he looked like he might keep walking anyway. Then he stopped. The folder remained tucked against his side. The reporter moved first. Not running, just fast enough to close the distance. Her camera operator followed. The commissioner watched carefully. So did everyone else. The entire atmosphere around the lake shifted again. Minutes earlier, people had been discussing water levels. Now they were watching behavior. And behavior often reveals more than documents. The board member attempted a smile. It did not last. Just gathering event paperwork, he said. Nobody asked the question he was answering. That detail landed badly. The commissioner extended his hand. Let me see the folder. The board member hesitated. Another dangerous pause. Around us, the afternoon breeze rattled the banner above the stage. The sound felt strangely loud. The lake continued pulling away from the shoreline. A stretch of wet mud nearly 6 feet wide now separated the water from a row of decorative stones. Guests were taking photographs of that too. Evidence was multiplying everywhere. The board member finally handed over the folder. The commissioner opened it. Several pages slid loose immediately. One landed on the grass. The reporter bent down and read the heading before anyone could stop her. Her eyebrows rose. That reaction caught everyone's attention. The commissioner picked up the page and continued reading. His expression changed slowly. Not shock. Recognition. The kind that comes when scattered pieces suddenly connect. One of the water management officials stepped closer. The commissioner handed him the document. The official read it in silence. Then he looked toward the enclosure beneath the stage. Then back to the paper. Interesting, he said quietly. Diane stepped forward. What is it? Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched. The crowd sensed it. Conversations stopped again. Even the children near the shoreline had become quiet. A floating dock creaked as another section settled lower against its supports. The sound echoed across the water. The official finally spoke. This appears to be a proposed access modification request. Diane blinked. Proposed? Not approved. He flipped to the next page. Not reviewed either. The commissioner took the documents back and continued reading. I stayed silent. The records were telling their own story now. They did not need my help. A gust of wind carried the smell of lake mud across the gathering. More exposed shoreline meant stronger odors. Several guests noticed. One woman covered her nose briefly. Another pointed toward newly exposed rocks near the opposite bank. The visual change was accelerating. The engineer checked fresh measurements on his tablet. His jaw tightened. Another small clue. Another warning. The reporter asked a simple question. Did the HOA submit plans involving the control structure? Diane answered immediately. We explored options. The official looked up from the paperwork. Options involving infrastructure require authorization. Diane said nothing. That silence was louder than her earlier speeches. Nearby, the first water management official finished examining the enclosure. He walked back, carrying a small object sealed inside a clear evidence bag. Sunlight flashed across the plastic. Several people leaned forward. Even from a distance, I recognized what he was holding. The broken inspection seal. The same seal I had photographed earlier. The official handed it to the commissioner. This was removed recently, he said. Very recently. The commissioner stared at the bag for several seconds. Then he looked toward the stage supports, the lock, the folder, and finally the shrinking lake. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were forming a picture. Around us, County guests stopped pretending this was a celebration. The stage sat nearly empty. The food tables were forgotten. Every eye remained fixed on the growing investigation. Then the engineer looked down at his tablet and suddenly went pale. "You need to see this," he said. The engineer turned the tablet so the commissioner could see the screen. Everyone nearby leaned closer. Nobody spoke. Even the reporter stopped taking notes for a moment. The wind moved through the reeds along the shoreline with a soft hissing sound. The lake looked different now than it had that morning. Larger sections of exposed mud stretched along the banks. Rocks that had not seen daylight in years sat uncovered near the edge. The commissioner stared at the tablet. Then he stared longer. That alone told me the information mattered. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Regional monitoring records," the engineer replied. He enlarged a chart and pointed to a series of timestamps. "This shows flow activity over the last 48 hours. The first water management official stepped beside him. His expression hardened almost immediately. The reporter noticed that too. Cameras were recording everything now. Nobody cared about the ribbon-cutting ceremony anymore. The story had changed. The engineer tapped the screen again. The increase began late at night. He moved to the next entry, then increased again several hours later. The commissioner frowned. "Twice." "Yes." Another murmur moved through the crowd. 2 separate changes meant planning. 2 separate changes meant someone had returned after the first adjustment. Nearby, a guest lowered his sunglasses and looked toward the enclosure. Another pointed at the stage supports built directly above it. People were beginning to connect the same dots. Diane stood perfectly still. Her earlier confidence had disappeared. Not completely, but enough for everyone to notice. The first official looked at me. "Did you authorize any gate changes?" "No." "Any maintenance crews?" "No." He nodded slowly. The answer fit the data. A loud creak echoed from the floating dock again. This time the sound lasted longer. Several people turned immediately. The dock sat visibly lower than it had earlier. One side had settled enough to expose additional support brackets beneath the structure. The visual evidence kept growing. No presentation could compete with that. The engineer continued scrolling through the records. Then he stopped. His finger remained on the screen. "There is another issue." Those 4 words hit harder than the first discovery. The commissioner looked up sharply. "What now?" The engineer zoomed in on a permit reference attached to the monitoring records. I recognized the document number instantly. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from realization. The same reference appeared throughout the maintenance files stored in my shed. It was tied directly to the lake's approved operating conditions. The engineer read carefully. "Any modification affecting flow rates requires owner notification." Silence followed. The reporter wrote the sentence down word for word. The commissioner removed his glasses again. Diane looked toward the crowd, then toward the stage, then toward the shrinking shoreline. She was searching for stable ground. There was not much left. A volunteer quietly lowered one of the event banners. Nobody told him to. He simply sensed the mood had changed. Around him, several guests began leaving the seating area altogether. Some moved closer to observe. Others returned to their vehicles. The celebration was dissolving. The smell of damp mud had become stronger than the smell of barbecue. Nature was rewriting the atmosphere in real time. The first water management official examined the broken inspection seal once more. "This access point was opened," he said. "The records suggest adjustments followed." The commissioner folded his arms. "Can we verify that?" Before anyone answered, the county engineer looked back at the enclosure, then at the stage platform resting above it. His eyes widened slightly. Another small detail. Another discovery. He pointed toward a narrow gap beneath the structure. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think somebody left something behind." The engineer moved toward the narrow gap beneath the stage while everyone watched. Nobody tried to stop him. Even Diane remained silent. The crowd had reached that strange point where curiosity becomes stronger than certainty. A warm gust rattled the aluminum frame above us. Loose banner cords tapped against the support poles. The engineer crouched carefully and shined a flashlight into the shadows beneath the platform. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he reached forward. The silence across the shoreline deepened. I could hear small waves brushing against exposed mud 20 yards away. The lake sounded different now. Smaller. Tighter. The engineer backed out holding a weatherproof clipboard covered in dirt. Several people exchanged looks immediately. The commissioner stepped closer. The reporter nearly forgot to take notes. "What is that?" someone asked from the crowd. The engineer brushed away mud with his thumb. A faded label appeared across the top. Temporary site notes. The commissioner accepted the clipboard and began turning pages. Most contained rough measurements and equipment checklists. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. He read the page again. The first water management official stepped beside him. So did the second. Their expressions changed almost simultaneously. Another piece had fallen into place. Diane took a step forward. "What does it say?" The commissioner did not answer immediately. He continued reading. The reporter waited. Cameras remained fixed on the documents. Finally, the commissioner lifted his head. "There are references to the access structure." A murmur swept through the crowd. Diane looked toward the enclosure, then toward the documents, then back toward the crowd. The engineer pointed to several handwritten entries. These notes describe measurements taken near the control gate 3 days ago. The first official flipped to another page. And again 2 nights ago. More silence. The shoreline seemed to hold its breath. Nearby, a boat resting at the dock shifted slightly as the water level continued dropping. The hollow knock echoed across the lake. Every sound felt amplified now. The commissioner turned another page. "There are initials here." The reporter immediately asked whose initials they were. Nobody answered. One of the HOA board members looked away. Another suddenly became very interested in his phone screen. The reaction spoke louder than words. The engineer studied the remaining pages carefully. "This is not an engineering report," he said. "This looks like planning notes." Diane crossed her arms. "Planning for what?" The engineer pointed toward a diagram sketched in the margin. "Even from where I stood, I recognized the shape. It was the control structure. Someone had drawn arrows showing flow direction. Another arrow pointed toward a handwritten phrase. Improve shoreline appearance." Several guests exchanged confused looks. The commissioner frowned. "Appearance?" The first official nodded slowly. "Some people lower water temporarily to expose shoreline features during inspections or construction." Diane's face lost color. "Only a little, but enough." The reporter caught it immediately. "Cameras notice everything." The engineer continued reading. "There is also a reference to increased visibility for the grand opening event." Nobody spoke. Wind moved across the lake again. The smell of wet mud seemed stronger now than ever before. More exposed shoreline stretched along the opposite bank. What had started as a beautiful backdrop for photographs was becoming evidence visible from every angle. The commissioner closed the clipboard and stared at the shrinking lake. "Who authorized this?" he asked quietly. The question hung over the crowd. No answer came. Not from Diane. Not from the board members. Not from anyone. The water management officials exchanged another glance. They had enough experience to recognize the direction this was heading. Then the engineer looked at his tablet again, and his expression tightened. "The latest reading just came in," he said. "The lake has dropped another 2 inches since our last measurement." Several people gasped softly. The commissioner looked back toward the water. So did everyone else. And for the first time all day, Diane seemed genuinely worried about what tomorrow morning might reveal. The crowd remained near the shoreline long after the celebration had effectively ended. Nobody wanted to leave. People sensed they were watching something important unfold. The sunlight had begun shifting toward late afternoon, casting longer shadows across the exposed mud. The lake looked wounded now. Not destroyed, not empty, but undeniably different from the image printed on the event flyers. The engineer lowered his tablet and walked toward the dock again. The commissioner followed. So did the water management officials. Reporters moved with them like a second wave. Cameras pointed toward every measurement marker, every exposed rock, every visible sign that the lake was continuing to change. I stood near the shoreline and watched another small section of bank emerge from the water. The dark mud glistened beneath the sun. A cluster of reeds that had been partially submerged all summer now stood fully exposed. Nature was documenting the situation better than any report could. The first official completed another measurement and recorded the result. He compared it against earlier numbers. Then he looked toward the commissioner. "The trend is consistent." The commissioner nodded slowly. Nobody needed an explanation anymore. The evidence had become visible to everyone. Diane remained near the stage. She was no longer speaking, no longer directing volunteers, no longer posing for photographs. The stage behind her sat mostly empty. Several folding chairs had already been stacked. Event staff moved quietly, unsure whether they should continue cleaning up or simply disappear. The energy had changed completely. One of the reporters approached me. "Have you seen anything like this before?" she asked. I looked toward the water. "I have seen what happens when systems are altered without understanding the consequences." She wrote that down immediately. Nearby, the engineer was reviewing permit records on his tablet while speaking with the officials. Every few minutes, someone pointed toward the enclosure. The control structure had become the center of the entire story. Not the stage, not the speeches, not the event, the infrastructure underneath it. Exactly where the truth had been hiding all along. A cool breeze rolled across the lake. The smell of wet earth grew stronger. Guests who had arrived expecting a celebration now stood in small groups discussing permits, ownership, and maintenance records. Most of them had never thought about water rights before today. Now they could not stop talking about them. The commissioner eventually returned to our group, carrying the weathered clipboard recovered from beneath the stage. "We have enough questions to justify a formal review," he said. Several reporters immediately reacted. Pens moved. Cameras lifted. Diane closed her eyes briefly. Only for a second. Then she opened them again. The first water management official carefully placed the broken inspection seal into a larger evidence envelope. Another official logged photographs of the lock and enclosure. Every action remained calm and professional. No drama. No shouting. Just documentation. That was what made it powerful. Facts accumulate quietly until they become impossible to ignore. A loud splash suddenly echoed across the lake. Heads turned instantly. A small floating marker near the opposite bank had shifted position as the water receded. The sound itself was harmless, but the reaction it created was revealing. People expected more changes now. They were watching the lake the way people watch a clock during a countdown. The engineer checked his tablet again. His eyes narrowed. Then he called the commissioner over. They spoke quietly for less than a minute. The commissioner looked toward me afterward. "Ethan," he said, "there is one document we have not seen yet." I already knew which document he meant. It sat inside my truck, stored in the same binder as the maintenance records. The original operating agreement tied to the lake's control system. The document that explained exactly who had authority over the water, and exactly who did not. Then the commissioner asked to read it. I walked to my truck while dozens of eyes followed me. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. Behind me, the lakefront remained unusually quiet. The celebration had transformed completely. Nobody was thinking about speeches anymore. Nobody cared about the decorations or the abandoned refreshment tables. The story had become bigger than the event. I opened the passenger door and pulled the weathered binder from beneath the seat. The edges were worn from years of inspections and maintenance visits. Inside were maps, agreements, inspection logs, and operating records. Documents most people would never find interesting. Today, they had become the center of attention. When I returned to the shoreline, the commissioner, engineers, water officials, and reporters were waiting. Diane stood, several feet away. Her posture remained rigid. She looked exhausted now. Not physically, mentally. The confidence that had fueled the grand opening ceremony had slowly drained away alongside the lake. I handed the binder to the commissioner. He immediately opened it. The first pages contained maintenance schedules. The second section contained inspection reports. Then he reached the operating agreement. The engineer stepped beside him. So did the water management officials. The reporter moved closer with her notebook ready. The commissioner read silently for several moments. Then he flipped back and read part of it again. His expression changed. Not surprise. Confirmation. That was worse. Confirmation meant the evidence was aligning. The engineer pointed toward a section halfway down the page. There. The commissioner nodded. The first water management official read the same paragraph. Exclusive operational authority, he said quietly. The reporter wrote those words down immediately. Several guests standing nearby heard them too. A ripple of conversation moved through the crowd. The commissioner continued reading. The engineer checked another page. Then another. The sound of turning paper seemed strangely loud against the background of the shrinking lake. A distant gull called from the far shoreline. Wind pushed small ripples across the remaining water. The exposed banks stretched farther every hour. The physical reality matched the paperwork perfectly. That was becoming impossible to ignore. The commissioner finally looked up. The operating agreement is clear. Nobody interrupted him. Control modifications require authorization from the owner and regulatory review. Diane lowered her eyes briefly. One of the board members stared toward the parking area. Another folded his arms and said nothing. The silence around them felt heavy. The reporter asked the obvious question. Was authorization granted? The commissioner looked at me. Was it? No, one word. Simple. Direct. The answer settled across the crowd. The engineer opened his tablet again and compared timestamps against the inspection records in the binder. His finger moved slowly down the screen. Then, he stopped. The first official noticed immediately. What did you find? The engineer enlarged one entry. The timing matches. Another important sentence. The commissioner leaned closer. Matches what? The unauthorized access window. Several people exchanged glances. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. Access. Modification. Increased outflow. Falling water levels. Every piece fit. Nearby, another section of exposed shoreline emerged beside the dock. Several guests pointed toward it. One reporter photographed the change. The lake itself was becoming a witness. Nature was preserving the timeline in real time. The commissioner closed the binder carefully. He did not slam it. He did not raise his voice. He simply held it under one arm and looked across the water. The calmness somehow made the moment feel even more serious. We will need a complete review, he said. The water officials agreed immediately. The reporter smiled slightly. She knew the story had reached a turning point. Diane looked toward the enclosure beneath the stage one final time. Then toward the exposed shoreline. Then toward the binder, now resting in the commissioner's hands. For the first time all day, she seemed to understand exactly how much had been documented. Then a county vehicle pulled into the parking area carrying someone nobody expected to see. The county vehicle rolled slowly across the gravel parking area and stopped near the shoreline. Every conversation paused. Reporters turned their cameras immediately. The commissioner looked up from the binder. Even Diane seemed surprised. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out carrying a hard-sided document case beneath one arm. I recognized her instantly. So did the county engineer. She was the senior records supervisor for the county archives division. She rarely appeared in the field. If she showed up in person, it usually meant someone had requested verification from original records. The crowd sensed the importance before anyone explained it. She walked directly toward the commissioner. The late afternoon sun reflected off the metal clasps on her case. Behind her, the lake continued retreating from the shoreline. The exposed mud stretched farther than it had that morning. The grand opening banner still hung above the stage, but now it looked forgotten. The records supervisor greeted the commissioner quietly and handed him a sealed envelope. The reporter moved closer. Cameras followed. The commissioner opened the envelope and removed several certified copies. He reviewed the first page, then the second, then he stopped. The engineer stepped beside him. So did the water officials. Nobody spoke. The silence returned once again. It had become the soundtrack of the day. Wind crossed the lake. Water tapped softly against exposed stones. Somewhere near the parking lot, a vehicle door closed. The commissioner finally looked up. These are the original property records. The reporter immediately raised her notebook. Several guests stepped closer. Diane remained perfectly still. The commissioner continued reading. The records confirm ownership boundaries, infrastructure rights, and operational authority. The engineer accepted one of the documents and reviewed it carefully. Then he nodded. The first water management official did the same. Every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. The story was no longer based on assumptions. It was based on records. Certified records. The reporter asked whether the findings matched the operating agreement from my binder. The commissioner answered without hesitation. Yes. One word. Simple. Final. Around us, the crowd reacted quietly. Some exchanged looks. Others nodded. A few simply stared toward the lake. The truth had arrived in the least dramatic way possible. Through paperwork. Through documentation. Through facts. Diane lowered her head briefly. The board members beside her remained silent. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged the records. They could not. The engineer closed his tablet. The water officials secured their notes. The reporter stepped away to deliver an update to her station. The event had reached its ending. Not with a confrontation. Not with raised voices. With evidence. The commissioner handed the certified copies back to the records supervisor and then turned toward the crowd. A formal review will move forward, he said. The relevant agencies now have what they need. That statement carried more weight than any speech delivered from the stage earlier that day. People began gathering their belongings. Folding chairs disappeared. Volunteers packed equipment into trucks. The remaining guests slowly drifted toward the parking area. The celebration that had been planned for months ended quietly. The lake remained. The records remained. The facts remained. As the shoreline emptied, I walked toward the water one last time. The evening light reflected across the remaining surface. The exposed banks would recover. The infrastructure would be inspected properly. The system would be returned to normal operation. That part would take time. But time was never the problem. The problem had been people believing appearance mattered more than reality. Behind me, workers finally removed the grand opening banner. The fabric folded in the wind before disappearing into a storage trailer. I watched the last piece vanish. Then I looked across the lake again. In the end, nobody remembered the speeches. Nobody remembered the decorations. They remembered what happened when documentation met arrogance. They remembered that ownership mattered. They remembered that systems have rules. And they remembered that the lake told the truth long before anyone else did.